certainty is overrated. And that's what our next guest is going to share on Fordify Live. Now, we are live on Facebook and LinkedIn and YouTube and a bunch of places, but please welcome to Fordify Live, Mark Sanborn, my friend and colleague, a Hall of Fame keynote speaker, best-selling author, known in the industry as the leadership expert. When you think about leadership, he's the guy. So, Mark, welcome to the show.
Ford, it's great to be with you. And you're right. I concur, certainty is overrated. We like to think we're certain until a plague or an interest rate hike or some kind of global cataclysmic event happens. And the reality is none of us can be sure of what the future holds. And for too many years, we've tried to reduce risk and increase certainty. And I think we live in a complicated world where we can't do that anymore. So the $1 million question is, if you can't be certain, what can you do? Well, I think we have to replace certainty with confidence. Confidence is about agility and innovation. It's the ability to anticipate and to learn a skill set, not just as a leader, but for the people that we lead, so that no matter what happens, we've got a head start on dealing with it. You know, we play a lot of what if scenarios, but I don't think we play that game very well or very deeply. And I think that we need to start training people to get away from process and planning. They're fine to the degree they last, which is a shorter and shorter self-life. And we need to teach people to be agile and innovative. That means try things. If they work, keep doing them. If they don't work, either change them or stop. And so this idea of, you know, the 3-ring binder 40 years ago when I was in corporate America,
Yep.
or now, you know, the digital file, you came back from the annual retreat and sat on your shelf or sits in your computer.
Right.
Never to be
I've got
again.
a bunch of those.
I think that's well behind us. We got to look at what are the concepts that let us become confident.
All right. So we've got listeners from franchise brands, corporations, and associations that participate on Fordify Live. And we're also live, this is also the podcast for the Business Growth Show. So some people may be listening to the audio later. So if you're listening to the audio, you can check Mark out at marksanborn.com. It's MarkSanborn.com. And of course, Google him, you know, you can find him online. All right. So we know that certainty is overrated. We know that you have to increase confidence. We know that there's a lot of disruption in the marketplace right now. Organizations are having trouble finding, retaining, and attracting top talent. They're doing battlefield promotions where they're just trying to get warm bodies and there's a lot of turnover. And so people get elevated into positions of leadership without the training. There's lack of accountability. There's lack of engagement. So I'm putting all those things out because you're the guy. Plus, I'm also going to be taking notes from my own staff. You're the guy that I would turn to for that. So let's start with, what do you do with organizations that have leaders that really aren't prepared to be leaders, and they haven't really been trained, or they've been trained by the archaic leadership that you said no longer works? What do they do? What do new leaders do now?
Well, bad leaders replicate other bad leaders and good leaders replicate good leaders. So it's pretty hard to break that cycle if you're in an entrenched organization. But Ford, I got to inject something because I know a few of your franchise clients, and I've done, like you, a lot of work with franchises. They got a little panicky when I talked about process. I'm not talking about the process that your franchise organization has developed for your franchisees to use.
Right.
I'm talking about a rigidity of thought that doesn't allow them to be flexible. You know, when I talk to franchise organizations, the biggest complaint I get from their leaders is, you know, we don't want people experimenting. That's why they joined the team. We already have the process. We don't want them messing with it. So I thought I better clarify that before everybody goes, oh, that guy has no clue what he's talking about. Well, first, I wrote a book a long time ago called You Don't Need a Title to Be a Leader. And the premise of the book is simply this. It's not your title or your position on the org chart that makes you a leader. It's your skill set. It's about the ability to influence others positively. And I want to say at a very basic level, leaders are those that make things better. And you don't need a title to do that. As a matter of fact, when you think about it, you know, you and I travel a lot. You check into a hotel, you meet the front desk person, the bell cap, the housekeeper, the wait people in the restaurant. I never meet the general manager, who is the highest titled leader, unless there's a really big problem.
Right.
And I decide I want to escalate it. So the entire experience in many organizations is created by people with no titles. We ought to be teaching them two things. When is it appropriate to lead and how to do it? And that's what my little book talks about. First of all, it's appropriate to lead when they can improve ROI. And because I work with managers that really like practical application, I'll say, explain that ROI does stand for return on investment. It's an accounting term.
Right.
But it can also stand for relationships, outcomes, and improvements. Those are three things that I want anybody on my team, whether they started yesterday, they've been here 30 years, to make better. Build better relationships with customers. Unfortunately, most employees are never taught how to do that. And our mutual friend, Dr. Nito Cobain, says, expectation without education equals frustration. So we really need to teach people what we're asking them to do. Build better relationships with customers and vendors. Look for ways to tweak the outcome. And by outcome, I mean, and this is a big part of my work, I don't know if we'll have a chance to get to it today. The customer experience is important, but it's not the end game. The end game is how the customer feels about doing business with you. Are they happier they chose you over a competitor? And if they are, then you better be designing and delivering for emotion, not just experience. I mean, I've had good experiences I wasn't happy about, not because they were good experiences, but because they weren't the experience that I expected. They weren't the experience that I wanted. So you need to look, how can we improve the outcome? And then finally, suggestions, especially in the franchise world, you know, the legendary McDonald's, the guy that came up with the filet of chicken, or the fish fillet sandwich, was doing business in a very Catholic part of Chicago where people didn't eat meat during Lent. And that's how they came up with a sandwich. And that, of course, became an industry and a franchise standard for them over the last many years. So first, tell people, if you can improve ROI, you got our blessing, go for it. And then secondly, and that's what the rest of the book really talks about, is, you know, what are the skills that enable people to do that?
All right. So the books, you don't need a title to be a leader. You can check it out on Amazon. If you're in your car, just pause the audio and you can check it out later when you get back. All right. So we know new leaders, you know that you don't have to be a title to be a leader, and you know that there's resources, and they know they need to take personal accountability. And we know that anybody can be a leader. And so that's the first thing is that ownership. And don't you think that you have to lead from the top down? I mean, don't you have to do some onboarding or some training? What would you recommend to an organization that, like, there's 3 steps, and I'm making this up, but is there 3 steps that all new leaders need to have in order to improve their leadership outlook? One, so is it authority? Is it training? Like, what are 3 things that a new leader should put down and work on improving?
Yeah, well, I will give you 3 things that I think are very fundamental. 1, be crystal clear about what you're trying to accomplish. If you're not crystal clear as a leader, nobody that you lead will be crystal clear either. Too many leaders are whiplashed by circumstance and change instead of focusing so they can move through change to achieve their goals. Secondly, and you got to teach people how to do this, take consistent action every day to do it, which means people understand, if this is our goal, if this is the big thing, what is my role in that? Because if you can't translate a concept into a concrete behavior, nothing happens. Sometimes annual reports are very lofty in their rhetoric and what they write, but the frontline employee or the franchisee or the middle manager says, okay, if that's what we're trying to do, what do I need to do? And then that brings me to the third point, and that is that a leader isn't just focused. A leader creates shared focus. Now, I will add a caveat, because this is something I work with my audiences now. 30, 40 years ago, you got focused, and that focus could last for a pretty long time. Now, you sometimes have to refocus very quickly. So I say leaders create shared focus, and they're able to refocus when circumstance requires it.
All right. So get crystal clear on, I was taking notes, get crystal clear and making sure you're communicating. And I know that one of the things that I've had challenges with, and you've worked with our organization at Prime Concepts, was I would delegate without details. I would delegate without, and because the hierarchy that I had set up, people would say, okay, because they weren't really clarifying. So we didn't have a 2-way feedback. So I would tell people to do something, and I would say, here's what success looks like. And I'd give them conditions of satisfaction, but then I might get an odd result, right? So get clarity.
Right.
Don't delegate without details. Number 2, take consistent action, right? That's what you said.
And make sure everybody knows what that is, because we assume that everybody on our team knows what it is. We're not just focusing attention, we're focusing action.
Actions.
Because
Focusing your
attention
actions.
without action is daydreaming.
And then make sure that you go from concept to the actual behavior engagement. And then not just a focus on number 3, but a shared focus. And I think that that's really important to put into the culture of your organization. I mean, culture is one of those words that's getting thrown around a lot. And I've said this before in other episodes that, organizations that I work with as a consultant, as a speaker, and so do you, they don't always know the difference between culture, communication, change, management,
Org chart.
team building, leadership. Like there's all these words thrown out, but they don't necessarily know what they mean. And they mean something different to the different generations in the marketplace, right? So there's all the different generational gaps. So we know that there's a few things that they can do. What are some pitfalls or landmines that leaders or new leaders should look out for or try to avoid?
The real question, I'll give leaders new or existing 2 questions to ponder. First is, who or what's better because of you? Because if everything is the same as when you started leading, you were managing, but you weren't leading. Leaders affect change, growth, movement, and progress, both in the organizations they lead and in the people they lead. So that's one of the things that keeps you on track. Who or what is better because of you? Then the other thing you've got to ask yourself as a leader is, are people following me out of commitment or compliance? In the olden days, we used our position as kind of a bludgeon, right? Do it. Why? Because I said so, which, reminds us of our childhoods when we were little kids and couldn't understand. So our parents just said, do it. And, you'll understand later. Well, you can't do that in the workplace anymore. You probably couldn't do it very effectively then. But commitment means people do it because they want to do it. And the key to commitment is the hardest part of leadership, and that's relationship. Here's the trick. You got to balance results against relationship. If you're just a relationship person, you're probably known as a good old boy or a good old gal, but not an effective leader. If you're a results-oriented person, at the result of relationships, you're known as a tyrant. So that balancing act is to maintain the two, to value people, but to make sure that the people you value results. It's got to be a causal chain. It can't be one or the other. The research that I've seen says that people who are high on both results and relationship, according to this research, only about 1% of leaders are good at both. Leaders typically tend to be good at one or the other, but about 1 out of 100 leaders are truly good at both.
Yeah. So real quick, I was writing down the tips. Who or what is better because of you? And number 2, are people following you out of commitment or out of compliance? And unfortunately, I hate to hit my little sound button again. I think I've led more for compliance. I mean, I want commitment. We all want commitment, but unfortunately, I might be old school and I've had to practice to relearn, especially with younger staff, to really get that commitment, to get that buy-in, to create that culture where there's open communication and, where we foster that. I mean, we've done more for our culture in the last 5 years than I ever did before. I mean, we have different onboarding, different communication processes, feedback loops, block time, lunch and learns. We have outings. We have culture building exercises or events where we just get to know them. And I think it's really changed with just the sincerity and the authenticity of that communication and allowing people to feel safe and comfortable in an environment that is rapidly changing and certainly uncertain. As we all go forward, we are live right now, but there's a lot of things going on in the economy and the political landscape with the money and, just you name it, spin the bottle. There's a gazillion things that are challenging us, but I think it's important to stay positive in outlook. What would you say to those organizations that maybe are dealing with a lot of uncertainty, but they want to do better, but they've just got an undertone of, instead of focusing on the positives, people in their organization are sometimes focusing on the negatives. So how do you get them to shift that mindset or shift their perspective?
Well, I'll say people will come late to complain about what's screwed up. And you can't stop them. People say, well, how do you get people to quit gossiping and bad mouthing? Good luck with
Right.
that.
Yeah.
What you can do as a leader is you can counterbalance it by being really good at spotlighting what is going well and who is doing a good job and what you are accomplishing. So I'll say, if you can't stop the negativity, become a counterbalance, because over time, people will start to realize it isn't all bad. A couple things I've got to address, though. Onboarding now is the single biggest predictor of whether or not an employee will be at your company in 2 years. And most companies that I've worked for
Terrible.
or with, they're terrible. I always they call it shadowing. Bob does what you're going to do. Follow Bob around, see what he does. Well, that doesn't work. And
Right.
really good onboarding takes time. We want everything real quickly. You can onboard quickly, but you're going to end up onboarding a lot more people than if you onboarded slowly and did it right. The other thing that is really cool about younger generations is they are really dedicated to making a difference. And in my last book, I say they want to be inspired. 83% of digital say they'd rather do work that matters, that makes a difference, than be recognized by their employer. So despite what you hear about clamoring for recognition, no, they want to matter, right? So
Right.
I define inspiration as motivation to the power of purpose. And if you can get people beyond the carrot and stick, I've got nothing against motivation. It's part of the equation. It's not all the equation. So when you can link that purpose to what people do every day so they can see the human impact, especially younger generations, they really want that. And that will go a long way in keeping them enthused and committed to their work.
Yeah. I found in my organization, the sense of purpose, because, I'm old school. So I thought that it was all about recognition, and their recognition comes from, are they making a difference? Is it making a difference for their
Yes.
coworkers? It's really been a culture issue. I also found that when I create the culture of accountability where the team knows what our core values are, then the team helps to change that negative. If there's someone who's negative or someone who's complaining or doing something that maybe isn't in alignment, that the team now has the authority to say, hey, that's not how we do things here. So instead of it becoming
that's self-enforcing.
yeah. So instead of it negative.
There's something else that just flitted across my brain. People have said in my work, what's the biggest change in leadership you've seen in almost 40 years, 37 years as a speaker and advisor? And I'll say the biggest change in leadership isn't in leaders, it's in followers. They aren't. We got to get past this mindset that we lead followers. No, the younger generations want to be treated as team members and collaborators and contributors and associates and colleagues. Wow. And occasionally somebody will say, well, is that just semantics? No, it's not semantics. Try, the biker gangs, try calling your spouse your old lady instead of your beloved wife and see if the reaction you get is any different, right? I mean, that's how important it is to use words wisely. And by the way, if you treat people like contributors, they'll start to contribute. If you value people, they'll become more valuable.
Yeah. So I think our listeners, if you're in a leadership position, maybe you take stock and you take an inventory on your team members, your immediate team members, and how well are you really communicating? How well are you appreciating them? How well are you creating a culture of accountability? How well are you onboarding? And maybe you need to go back through some onboarding procedures and revisit those things. Now, I know that coming up, you've got this famous book, The Fred Factor. Tell the listeners if there's two people under a rock that aren't familiar with it, what's the genesis? What was the inspiration for Fred Factor, which was almost 20 years ago, 2004. So next year it's going to be
first came out, but I met Fred a long time before that. Fred was my postal carrier. I bought a new home in Denver, and in essence, he was a guy with a simple job who made it extraordinary. He brought artistry to what most of us would think is pretty easy, sticking mail in a box day after day. And he so inspired me that I started speaking about him in my work, and then later wrote this book. It came out in 2004. It was a bestseller here in the US. In India, it sold about 2 million copies. And I was very gratified that it continues to sell so well that my publisher said, let's do a 20th anniversary edition. And there's a foreword by John Gordon and or excuse me, an introduction by John Gordon and a bigger forward by my friend John Maxwell. So I just want to make people alert to that. Comes out March of 2024. And here is the essence of all my work. I know as we're getting near the end, Ford, this might be a way to cap it off. I didn't realize until Tom Peters picked way back in 2005, one of his favorite quotes for 2004 from the book, which is, nobody can prevent you from choosing to be exceptional. You know, exceptional and extraordinary is a choice. You can encourage people, you can teach people, you can reward people, but ultimately a lot of us work in environments where we don't get any of that, but we can still choose to be extraordinary. I don't think people instantly think of the United States Postal Service when they think great customer service. Now, there's great service providers in the Postal Service, don't get me wrong. But as an organization, you're not going, let's study Ritz-Carlton or the United States Postal Service.
Right.
And so Fred worked in this system where extraordinary wasn't a norm. And perhaps that's why he stood out. He's retired now, but Fred Shea and his wife, Kathy, still live about 40 minutes north of us, and we still communicate on a regular basis.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, this has been Mark Sanborn. You can visit him, to connect with him on LinkedIn. He's got a lot of resources on his website at marksanborn.com. My friend and colleague, we're also in Speakers Roundtable together, and we've shared the stage at different platforms together. Well, thanks again, Mark. So everybody, we go live on Fordify Live Wednesdays at 11 a.m. Central on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook, and other platforms. Mark, thank you so much for being a guest today. Oh, look at that. We've got people cheering.
Oh, my goodness. The crowd goes crazy.
The crowd goes
Pleasure's
wild.
Mine. All the best.
All right. Thanks so much.